Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, June 20th, 2025, and today we are going to be making a 2028 presidential election prediction between Governor Gavin Newsom from the state of California and Vice President J.D. Vance from the state of Ohio. Now, the 2028 race is shaping up to be one that is starting very, very early. If you've been online, you might have seen that Governor Gavin Newsom has really been ramping up his presence and opposition to Donald Trump and this second Trump administration. J.D. Vance, who has already been heralded as the frontrunner for the 2028 race, is in a good position to win that nomination in about 3 years' time. But a lot can change between now and November of 2028, but it's never too early, as you know, if you've been here for a while on this channel, to take a look at hypothetical matchup scenarios. They're much more fun to do 3 years out. You can always compare and contrast what the actual result ends up being, but 2025 doesn't seem too far away from 2028, even though it is 3 years away. And that's largely because everything that we've been talking about and everything that has mattered thus far has been impacting what might happen in 2028. The electoral map is set, and this stage very much seems to be very shaky on the Democratic side as to who their nominee is going to be. Now, J.D. Vance, as a quick note, might be the frontrunner on the Republican side, but that doesn't mean that he is the most electable, nor does it mean that he's someone who can't be beaten in 2028. He obviously comes in with a huge electoral advantage as the incumbent vice president. But if Donald Trump's administration becomes too toxic, too much of a negative brand, similarly to what we saw in previous elections with incumbent administrations, Trump's included in 2020, you will find that by the time the election comes around, it might not actually be the best thing. That being the vice president at the time can often sometimes be the main reason why you lose an election. Now, on the total map here, we are working with not that many states that actually get talked about heavily. Anything you know about election predictions, you might know immediately that there's already going to be states that we determine to be safe or solid for a political party. In this case, and on my maps, what I typically do here is just say that these are states that are going to be won by the political party that I characterize it for by margins of roughly 15 points or more, meaning that these states are so far out of reach from being on the Republican side or the Democratic side, even in the worst case scenario for these incumbent parties because of where they are on the national stage and how they have previously voted. Now, everything I do in terms of my predictions also keeps in mind the present-day context. Donald Trump is unpopular, J.D. Vance is also unpopular, and on the national stage, people are looking for opposition to Donald Trump, including many of the voters that backed him in the last election. Now, the good news for J.D. Vance is that he is no Donald Trump, and the good news for Gavin Newsom also is that he is no Donald Trump. But it makes 2028 that much more difficult and different from the past 3 elections that Donald Trump will no longer be on the ballot, barring a constitutional amendment, for the first time since the 2012 election. And so what that means is on the broader national stage, this will largely be a much closer election. I think it will be closer than it was in 2020, closer than it was in 2024, closer than it was in 2016, 2012, or 2008. I think it'll be the closest election since the 2004 presidential election. And so the reason I say that is because I think that where we are thus far is that not much has changed in terms of the previous coalitions, but certainly the way candidates would appeal to said coalitions does in fact matter and does in fact make a major difference on the national stage. If we go ahead and characterize all of the states and districts that we expect to be solid for the GOP and solid for the Democratic Party, we end up with a number, about 121 electoral votes for J.D. Vance and about 167 for Gavin Newsom. Now, that's not too surprising. This is typically how it starts. Democrats have a slight advantage on the safe state front, but realistically speaking, once you add in those likely states, you really start to see why the Republican Party comes into this with an already outsized advantage over the Democratic Party. And to not waste time, we're going to characterize the likely states decided between margins of 5 to 15 points, that in a wave year, maybe we could see significant narrowing down and significant tightening up. But thus far, these states are more than likely, going to be voting for the political party that we characterize it for. And so on the Democratic side, these are states like Colorado and states like New Mexico that in the last presidential election went to Kamala Harris by margins of 11 points and 6 points. Reasonably speaking, would vote very similarly this time, maybe some slight improvements for Newsom depending on reach. I think for Colorado and New Mexico, maybe it would be around the same. I don't really expect Newsom to improve that much. On the western side of the United States, I also do think that there are electoral liabilities being from the state of California, the perception and the circumstances surrounding his governorship and the way that he had positioned himself prior to this election. There's a lot to consider there, a lot to talk about. It'll make more sense when we talk about Nevada and Arizona. But for now, I'd say Colorado and New Mexico, keep them likely as they were in the last election. Another state that I would say I would keep in the likely column is Virginia, largely too because of what we saw in terms of DOGE cuts, the federal government, interactions between state and national government, the way that Donald Trump's administration really did strike Northern Virginia and made it very difficult for many of the federal workers there. Virginia is just a unique state that is so close in proximity, similar to my home state of Maryland, to the nation's capital, that a lot of the decisions and a lot of these things that might only be felt or seen on the national stage through news stations, through coverage on social media, through Democratic opposition in local areas, is felt directly in Virginia and Maryland. When the federal layoffs hit, there were people, if you're from the area, you know somebody, right, who had their entire life uprooted, right? What we saw was that many of those people, including voters for Donald Trump, obviously that's not something that the DOGE, department knew about, but you're going to find that there are people who are very angry with Donald Trump's administration, and by consequence, J.D. Vance, I just don't imagine Virginia being any closer than it was in the last election. Virginia, likely for the Democrats. I would also say New Hampshire, similarly too, it was a bit closer for Kamala Harris. I don't think J.D. Vance has what it takes really to appeal to the voters in New Hampshire, and I also don't think what you're going to see is that J.D. Vance wins the exact same regions that Donald Trump does to the same degree. I think that J.D. Vance has electoral liabilities as well. He was an underperformer consistently in Ohio, didn't add much to the ticket in 2024. We saw that it took a $50 million investment to save him in a race after Donald Trump had just won the state by 8 points in 2 elections in a row in Ohio. So when I think about J.D. Vance too, I don't necessarily think Gavin Newsom comes into this being the perception-wise as the strongest Democrat for 2028, but I don't think J.D. Vance comes in as the strongest Republican either, and that's why I think it'll be a close race. New Hampshire, keeping in the likely Democratic column. Maine puts Democrats over the top at around 201 electoral votes, and New Jersey, I think without a doubt, is going to be a likely blue state there, and then that leaves us to about 215 electoral votes for Gavin Newsom. Now, on the Republican side, this is where they really shine through. They have their safe states that only amount to about a third of the map here, but it will be more than that when you look at the likely states. Iowa and Ohio, 2 states I just don't think, one, Gavin Newsom, not the right candidate to win in these states. I don't imagine large droves of white working class voters that were previously with Obama coming back to Newsom in 2028. They're very tapped in for Trump, would be very tapped in for Vance. I don't think it's going to be as large of a margin as Trump was, 13.5 in Iowa, Ohio being 11 points. I do think J.D. Vance actually does have somewhat of a home state disadvantage. I don't think voters love him in Ohio, but also the trend lines here just aren't great for Democrats too. So it would take an outsized overperformance for a candidate to even narrow down these races. That's not going to happen. Not with Gavin Newsom and not with J.D. Vance. Ohio, Iowa, boom. Republicans, 144 electoral votes. Now the big one that I think Democrats have been largely upset about is Texas. This is a huge state that they thought was moving their direction in the 2020 presidential election when it narrowed up to being a state decided by 5.6%. After all, Texas was a closer state than the state of Colorado, than the state of New Mexico, right? Texas was closer than Minnesota, than New Hampshire, right? These are all states, then Virginia, all states that were treated as swing states, invested in as swing states. Texas ended up being closer. It took decades for Democrats to get to that point, all for it to be washed away in one evening in the 2024 presidential election when Donald Trump won the state by 5 points more than he did in 2016 and 9 points more than he did in 2020. And so Texas being a 14-point state, even if J.D. Vance sees some underperformances and Newsom picks up some of the Latino vote share, which he might, in Texas, I don't think coming from California, it'll play well in the southern border. I don't think you're going to see enough Latino voters return, and I think J.D. Vance can pretty much just see a bit of a shaving off of that 14-point margin, still win by 11, 12 points. Either way, though, where are you at? 184 electoral votes. But that doesn't end there for the Republican Party. Another big state that Democrats also have seen really move away from them is the state of Florida, a state that had been long time a battleground that in 2024 shifted to being a state Donald Trump won by 13 percentage points. Look at these shifts from 2024. Miami-Dade County, for the first time, voted for a GOP candidate since 2004. You can take a look at Florida, 2004. Actually, no, I'm wrong about that too. Wow. I guess, let's see when we can find the last time. I'll assume 1988, but you can see that there was a huge shift. Miami-Dade used to be bastions of Democratic voters here. Obama won it by 24. Clinton won it by 29.6, right? Biden wins it by 7. Biden loses it. Harris loses it. Looking at it, huge shift. Florida, not in the Democratic column at all. So JD Vance 214. It also, we have to throw in Alaska, only a little bit more competitive because that's just how it is. Nebraska's first, a little bit more competitive there. And so that brings us to about 218 electoral votes for JD Vance. So now we're down to about 105 toss-up electoral votes. Realistically speaking, also narrows down just a little bit. I imagine JD Vance will hold on to that second district. But again, I think you're losing support in the New England region. I don't think that JD Vance would capture in those main second voters the same way that Trump did to the greatest degree. Romney couldn't crack it. McCain couldn't crack it. Bush couldn't crack it. Trump did. JD Vance is no Donald Trump. And Gavin Newsom, though, is also no Obama. No one's going to replicate Obama. No one's going to replicate Trump either. Maine second district, though, right now, lean red. Democrats, too. Maine, Minnesota is going to be lean blue, right? You have that there. That's going to be a state that I don't think you're going to see shifting too heavily. I think you need someone from the Midwest. I think you need someone who can win over huge pockets of this country that matter in elections and decide elections. I think he holds on to Nebraska second. I think he holds on to Minnesota, but by similar margin to that of Kamala Harris in the last election. Now, I want to start off on the West Coast as we get into these final swing states that we talked about in 2024, talked about in 2020, talked about in 2016, because these states are going to make or break the next election. I know it's weird, right? We've seen the same battleground states. Arguably, 2016 was very similar. We talked a lot about the Rust Belt. You can see all decided by less than a point. North Carolina was 3.7. Georgia was a bit on the other end, but Arizona was 3 points. Nevada was 2 points, right? These were close races. In 2020, Wisconsin was less than a point. Georgia was less than a point. Arizona was less than a point. Nevada was 2 points. Michigan was 2 points. Pennsylvania was 1 point. North Carolina was 1 point, right? 2024. Wisconsin's less than a point. Nevada is 3 points. Arizona gets a little bit back further in favor of Trump, but Georgia's 2 points. North Carolina is 3 points. Pennsylvania is 1.7. So these races and these states have largely defined the presidential level and will continue to do so in 2028. But here's my take. I think Gavin Newsom does not do that well amongst these swing state voters, at least not right now. We've seen a very intentional effort from the governor to rebrand himself as someone more towards the center, someone who's more moderate, willing to engage meaningfully with conservatives and Republicans across the country, and as a forceful opposition to Donald Trump's second administration. At the same time, when you think about the way that a state like California, just largely speaking, is perceived, you have to confront the reality of what a political ad might do, calling somebody a California liberal. Right, what that might mean in the 2028 election. And I don't think we've reached the point that Donald Trump's approval rating is low enough that you can generally say a Democrat would likely win the next presidential election. From my understanding thus far, we're at a 50-50 toss-up. And there's going to be stronger Republicans than others, stronger Democrats than others. And I don't know if Gavin Newsom's regional appeal translates outside of the state of California. You can see in 2022 and 2018 that while the margins here are certainly impressive, if California was a swing state, when it looks on the presidential level, it wasn't actually that much in favor of Newsom, in comparison at least to Biden's election result. You can see objectively, Biden won by 29.2% in 2020. In 2024, Harris saw a narrowing, but the narrowing was foretold by Newsom's narrowing in the 2022 race. He had just come off of a recall election that he arguably did very well in, was able to hold on to a huge portion of the vote, but a year later actually received less of the vote share. And when you think about 2018 too, Gavin Newsom running in a Dem midterm in California, the margin in theory should have been larger. And when I think about too, what we might see in this hypothetical 2028 race is that it will take a very, very, very skilled type of Democrat to actually outperform 2024. I know we know that 2024 was close, but 2020 was close too. 2016 was close too, and races are won on the margins. And I think that he does narrow down Arizona. I especially think, too, this reversal in support on immigration for the Trump administration will do damage to the way people perceive J.D. Vance in a southern border state, in a state that cares a lot about immigration. But enough so that Gavin Newsom wins the state, at least not yet. We are 6 months into the administration, 5 months, really, today. But people are souring, but not enough to solidly say Nevada and Arizona are back to being Democratic states. Now moving over to the eastern side of the United States, we have the Rust Belt and 2 Sun Belt states, North Carolina and Georgia. My original take was, I thought Georgia and North Carolina would share the same characterization. But given how close it was in the last presidential election, I don't know if J.D. Vance is going to really rile up rural turnout to the same degree, But I don't know if Gavin Newsom riles up minority turnout in Atlanta and the metro area the same way Biden did in 2020. I think he does improvements off of what Democrats did in 2016 when they lost the state by 5, and I think they actually improve off the 2024 margin when they lost the state by 2, but I don't know if they win the state. Right now, Georgia, tilt red. And so that leaves us to North Carolina, where I do actually think North Carolina votes to the right of Georgia, bringing J.D. Vance to about 268 electoral votes, about 2 votes off of winning the presidency outright. And this is where things really do hinge on the Rust Belt region. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania have been dictating the American political scene for the past 3 cycles, and I don't think 2028 would be that much different with Newsom and Vance at the top. Vance is from the Midwest. He holds that regional appeal to some degree, but I don't know if that has ever actually been performed or shown in a general election. Underperformed in Ohio, didn't change the results in Ohio in 2024. The data didn't show a bump from choosing J.D. Vance. Typically speaking, your VP is supposed to bump you up. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania are states that Newsom and Vance would be competing in heavily. And looking at the last cycle, I do think that there is enough persuasion in terms of elements there, in terms of turnout, and also just generally, too, changed minds from the last cycle, that Wisconsin does go to the Democratic Party. Narrowly, but goes to the Democratic Party. Brings them at least 10 electoral votes closer to the finish line. In Michigan and Pennsylvania, I think you will also see, too, that the types of energy that boosted to Trump to victory in 2024, largely in states like Michigan, came from regions around the Detroit metro area. The state was decided eventually by a margin of roughly 1.4%. It wasn't massive, and it wasn't one that is outsized what a traditional margin would be in a state like Michigan. And I think, too, that Donald Trump and his administration, and especially in terms of what's happening in the handling of the Israel and Palestinian conflict, not to mention, too, you're seeing a lot of souring on Donald Trump from a lot of the Muslim American community that supported him in the last cycle, that I do think would come back to hurt him, or J.D. Vance, rather, in 2028. And I think that's where you would see Michigan also narrowly move across that finish line for Democrats. But the state I'm less convinced about is the state of Pennsylvania, which isn't the state that saw the biggest swing from the last cycle, but saw the largest margin in favor of the Republican Party. That margin that also translated to Republicans winning a Senate seat they had not held since 2007 with Rick Santorum in 2024. Whereas states like Wisconsin and Michigan elected their Democrats in the Senate, did better for Democrats in other elections, Pennsylvania said Republican through and through. And that was the big problem here, I think Democrats face, is that Pennsylvania being a 2-point state, sure, is something that they can tackle and can win on. But I think it gives J.D. Vance the upper hand in 2028 against Governor Gavin Newsom. And so what I think we find here by the end of this map is that 3.5 years out, the math doesn't look super difficult for J.D. Vance in the way that it looked near impossible for Trump in 2017. And that's because Trump's approval rating is higher than it was in 2017. That's because generic ballot was better for Democrats in 2017 than it is today. And there are other outsized factors that can explain that maybe some candidates won't beat J.D. Vance in 2020, but maybe they will, right? This is just a hypothetical very early on, and a lot can change and will change before November 2028. But it brings us here. J.D. Vance at 287 electoral votes, Gavin Newsom at 251. Newsom gets closer than Harris. He flips Wisconsin and Michigan, but he loses the election to J.D. Vance in this hypothetical. Georgia's closer, North Carolina's closer, Arizona and Nevada are closer. The margins are being shaved, but it doesn't translate directly to an electoral college victory outright. And so J.D. Vance, in this circumstance, would be the next president of the United States. So, very interesting map, definitely a very interesting matchup. I think it really could go either way, though. If Pennsylvania just flips by a point, the entire presidency is decided differently. These elections are being decided by the same exact states that decided them 4 years, or a year ago, 4 years before then, 4 years before then, and that's just the current nature of American politics. 7 states to rule them all. Sounds like Lord of the Rings. We are at a point where these battleground states really do dictate the future of 350 million Americans, and it often comes down to just a handful of votes in these 7 states. Definitely a close race to watch. Newsom, J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance wins 287 electoral votes. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join, and also a video for you to watch and a playlist for my 2028 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.